Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 10th of June. Today we will be discussing the Zaporozhye front, but we will also be discussing some of the other parts of the front line that have been chronically ignored. And so I'm going to go over them pretty briefly because there are a few minor frontline changes that I have not discussed that occurred over the past week or so. But let's begin by talking about the most important part of the front line where we are seeing the most activity on both sides, and that is the Zaporozhye front, where Ukraine is now, you could say, in day really 5 of their counteroffensive. If we say that it started on June 5th, and by now they're really entering the third wave of attacks, because if we accept that the first wave is June 5th with those attacks on the Velika Novosilka salient, then that would be the first attack. And then the second one would be really the wave that occurred around June 7th, June 8th, the one that I talked about in my last video that was really dedicated to talking about the latest Ukrainian attacks, which included attacks on towns such as Lobkove and advances in the direction of Novopokrovka and all around the Orikhiv area. And so now we're really in the third phase of that. And of course, it's not perfectly divided up into phases because this is going on such a broad front that a lot of these attacks are concurrent. I'm just trying to group it together for the sake of simplicity, but you could sort of see how the third one formed really yesterday, June 9th, and has really spilled over into June 10th, because what I'll say is that today there hasn't been that much that occurred. It has really been a stalemate for the past 24 hours, and so much of the change that I'm going to be referring to today occurred on June 9th, not even today. And so that's really connected, those 2 days, 9th and 10th. But let's begin by talking about Orikhiv in that general direction, where you had, as I was saying before, on the 7th and the 8th, some pretty significant Ukrainian attacks that really yielded no gains at all, besides capturing a few open fields that we discussed in previous videos and taking over the town of Lobkove. They did approach some fortifications, and you can see that I added in the fortifications around most of the towns. Of course, I didn't add in every single trench, and it is a bit of a generalization what I did. If you want to see each specific point with a ditch and a trench, then there are websites that I've linked previously in videos that do actually show each one. This one's just like a broad overview so you get which areas on the front line and within the rear are the most fortified. And so you can see that there's not one first line of defense, there's not one second line of defense. It really does depend on where the town is located, where the highways are located, but you can clearly see where there are some significant lines that appear. And so if you want to look at this more detailed, then my map's in the description for public use. But anyway, what we were talking about is that the Ukrainians, they regrouped from their attacks on the 7th and the 8th, which did experience a high level of casualties. Not even talking about men, but specifically with tanks and vehicles. We know for sure that they suffered a lot of damage in those regards, especially when they came into contact with a lot of the mines that had been placed by the Russians that weren't properly cleared. And so the Ukrainians regrouped, and they utilized more than just one brigade, because really in their first or second wave, you could say that a lot of the attacks were conducted by the 47th Mechanized Brigade. But that's not the only unit that's fighting in Orikhiv. There's a few other units that I'm going to add in as time goes on that I need to look for. I need to look for their information to verify if they're in this area. But I'm pretty sure that the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade is also now in Orikhiv in this general direction, and that they are being tasked with conducting the offensive in tandem with the 47th Brigade, which is interesting because the 128th Brigade is extremely experienced in comparison with every other unit that has been publicly known to be involved in this counteroffensive, because this one was involved in the Kherson counteroffensive. It was also involved in the battle for Bakhmut, and now it appears that it's been moved to Zaporozhye, and this level of combat experience is not even close to being rivaled by any other unit. Like the 47th Brigade was formed last year in April, and it's mainly just been in training sessions with NATO. And so there is a huge difference. Maybe the Ukrainians are trying to shake up the makeup of their forces in this area to add some experience into the mix, which might be necessary in some of these areas. But either way, you're seeing more units being flooded in. Russian sources reported about 10 brigades on the entire Zaporozhye line that seem like they are being moved in and preparing for more attacks. And so at least some of those brigades that are alluded to by the Russian sources are going to be around the Orikhiv. Not all of them, because there are obviously other axes of attack. But it does seem like more and more brigades are being added in, which shows that the Ukrainians have just begun with these attacks. They probably have hundreds more infantry fighting vehicles and tanks at their disposal, many of which came from NATO, but also a lot of their older Soviet weaponry that they still have, like the T-72s. They will probably utilize those as well. And so what we saw yesterday and today is that the Ukrainians did launch certain attacks in some sectors, but they actually lost the one town that they had under their control that they took from the beginning of the counteroffensive on the 5th, and that is Lobkove. Lobkove, if you recall in my last video, I talked about how it was retaken by the Ukrainians after a push from Stepove, and then push along the highway, and then the Russians regrouped around Pyatikati. It seems like they were able to regroup pretty quickly, and this unit is in 19th Motor Rifle Division, regrouped and then promptly pushed out the Ukrainians from their new positions in Lobkove. And so that's the one town that Ukraine was able to retake, and now it's back under Russian control. You can see that they have not been able to breach the first lines of defense for the Russians in some of these forward towns like Konovalova or Dolinka or Mirny or Nestiarinka, which is it's a pretty important town when you look at how it's connected to roads that lead deeper into Zaporozhye. Where they did have at least a limited amount of success is directly to the south of Orikhiv, which is also an area where they have the highest amount of troop concentration. And so in this area, the Ukrainians advanced at most 5 kilometers. So their positions on the 9th were just to the south of Novodanilivka. And the new columns that they sent on the 9th, which according to some sources from both sides had up to 3 times as much vehicles as the initial columns in the initial attacks, they were able to push through some of these open fields over here that I'm going over in red, and pushed pretty close to some Russian towns on not even the line of contact. Now they are closer to the line of contact, like Robotyne and Kopani. And you can see that there's one trench line over here that's sort of isolated, that's connecting the two of them. It's not even connected to the main Russian trench line to the south. So it's one of the more forward fortifications, and even then the Ukrainians did not even reach that one. And so really their success amounts to taking over a couple of open fields, and even some of the fields that they did take today have been retaken by the Russians. For instance, over here we have a geolocated video which shows that the Ukrainians, they had a kamikaze drone and they hit a Russian BMP-3. So of course that shows that the Ukrainians are also destroying some of the Russian vehicles in this area, but this also confirms that the Russians still have a presence in some of these open fields and in some of these bush lines that were previously marked as under Ukrainian control, which does show that the Russians were able to retake at least some of them back. And there's still no indication that the Russian lines are threatened around Robotyne and Kopani. And zoom out for a second, you'll see that the main Russian line is even further to the south, which does indicate that on June 9th, the attack was not successful in breaking through in this area, and that on June 10th, it just sort of stalled. Nothing really happened on June 10th that is as significant in terms of changing the front lines. Of course, we know that Ukraine does have more resources at their disposal, and so this is not over. I'm not trying to say that Ukraine won't make any gains. I'm sure that at some point they might find a certain area where they do break through to a certain extent and make gains, but I'm saying that as of now they have failed to do so in any sort of area and to a great extent, and that it's going to require a lot of work to even reach these first lines if they couldn't have done it in their first 5 days when they were amassing everything and the Russians were the least prepared. Now they're obviously even more prepared because they're moving in a lot of their artillery. They're moving in their air sorties that are flying over the Zaporozhye airspaces and targeting some of the Western equipment, which of course is good, and you can make an argument that it's better than a lot of the Russian equivalents that they have. But why would that even matter when those Western tanks and those Western infantry fighting vehicles aren't receiving the proper air support. They're not receiving good artillery cover, so the Ukrainians, they don't have very good counter battery fire in a lot of these areas. So then how are they supposed to take out the Russian artillery that is much more superior in terms of quality? You could argue, but in terms of sheer magnitude, you can't argue. The Russians simply have much more. And then even in some of the non-traditional modes of fighting, like drone warfare, even then the Russians are still utilizing it. They're mass producing these drones, like the Lancet drones, and then they're sending them off. And they don't cost that much. They cost $20,000 to $40,000, these Lancet 3 drones, and they are extremely effective against really a lot of different vehicles. You can say that maybe it's better against the Humvee or against some less armored, like a lightly armored vehicle, but now videos are coming out that indicate that a lot of these Lancets are actually being used on the Western weaponry and at least causing it to be damaged. So we're actually going to look through that. Here's credit to this account that has compiled a lot of these videos. I'll link the videos in the description for you guys. Here you can see some of the videos of the Lancets that are flying in the direction of the tanks. Now, in this video specifically that you're seeing right now, it's not entirely known if it hit the vehicle itself, because you can see that the video shut off before it hit the tank and the trajectory wasn't really at the same angle as the tank itself. So maybe in that certain instance the Lancet didn't hit the tank, but then there's 2 other videos that show a Lancet hitting a tank, and then there's a third one over here which shows other vehicles being hit, including Leopard 2A6 and then several other Leopard 2A4s. And so at the very least, these Leopards were damaged. Maybe some of them are still in operation if they hit some of the frontal armor, but there is a possibility that the Lancets are going for some of the less armored areas, more thinly armored parts of the tank. And so, for instance, they can be going up against some of the engine compartments. Those would be good areas to hit. In one of the videos showing that the drones were hitting the Leopards, the drone actually hit the ammo storage compartment, and so that's a good area to hit, and it could also cause some sort of secondary explosion, and either way it would take out the ammo of the tank. Also, you could hit the rear, you could hit really the top of the turret sometimes, and that could work, or even the side armor, which is obviously still armored, but it's obviously thinner than the frontal armor. And so there are different options, and we do know that at least the new iterations of the Lancets, they are much more potent than the older Lancets, and so now they have a very capable warhead that does explode before impact and then is able to penetrate through some armor. Obviously not all of it, depending on the thickness and if it has like ERA or something like that, but it could prove to be very effective, especially against Leopards, as we're seeing in these videos. And for reference, the Leopards, they cost $9 million, and then this Lancet costs like $40,000, and that's just a huge mismatch and huge disparity in the cost and the effectiveness as well. So it's very interesting to see how Russia's utilizing non-traditional means to destroy some of these Western weaponries, which of course is good, but really on its own, it's very difficult for it to thrive in these environments. And so that's what we're seeing here. In terms of the casualty numbers, we don't have good information about this. I don't want to be spreading information that is just rumors and speculation, but from publicly available videos, we know that a lot of different Humvees, Bradleys, M113 armored personnel carriers have been damaged. As I was saying before, there's like about 5 Leopards that have been destroyed up until now, and there's probably more that we haven't seen on video yet, and this includes 2A4 and 2A6s, and you know the 2A6s are even more advanced than the 2A4s, so it is big that Ukraine has lost some of those as well. We also know that there's been different vehicles such as the Max Pros, those MRAPs, that have been damaged on video. There's one T-72 tank that was damaged. There's one Dutch YPR 6765 that was damaged. There's also a French VAB armored personnel carrier that was destroyed. And so yeah, there's a large collection of videos. I think that the number now is I kind of added up to like 74 different pieces of vehicles or different units of vehicles that have been destroyed on the Ukrainian side. And so that's a lot of Ukrainian vehicles that were destroyed specifically, and that's only what we have recorded. We know that the Russians are recording their videos much more than the Ukrainians are recording their own. That might be in order to hide embarrassment, or it might be for some operational security purposes, because Ukraine's in the midst of their own plans that they have for the future, while the Russians are more on the defensive. And so yeah, all in all, the situation is like that on the southern front. In terms of what we could see in the future, there's actually some rainfall that's expected in Zaporozhye for the next 3 to 6 days, which will make it harder for the Ukrainians and some of their mobile units that are relying on quick, speedy advances with columns to advance, because the rain's going to cause the ground to be softer and muddier depending on how much it rains. If it's like a light rain, then it won't really cause anything, and so Ukraine should be able to continue advancing. If they don't, then it would just be an excuse in the rain. But if there's some hard rain, then yeah, it could, especially for the heavier equipment, cause it to get bogged down in the mud. And there's also supposed to be some rain from like June 20th, June 24th. Here's just one slide that talks about the percentage change of precipitation. So like you can see, tomorrow there's a 96% chance, so no doubt that will cause, at least tomorrow, the Ukrainian operations to stall. And then I'll just go through and show you the percent chance for every single day. You could see that on the 18th it's 57%, and then it like goes up like 19th 53%, 28th 59%, and then 21st it's pretty much a good chance that it will be raining. So that entire time it will be much more difficult for the Ukrainians to advance. And of course, the weather forecast is subject to change. But yeah, let's move on to the situation on the Donetsk front. In Donetsk, the Ukrainians have been able to take back some of the fields and some of the trenches that they had lost in previous Russian advances. And so this is probably in order to give the supply routes to the north of Opitny and the ones that are connecting to Avdiivka some breathing space, because the previous line looked something like this. So the Russians were actually pretty close to some of these supply lines that I have marked in yellow. So this seems like an effort to just cut off any sort of potential future advance, and the springboard for this advance would be around Opitny, which is why the Ukrainians tried advancing even further south towards the town of Opitny, which is being held, I believe, by the DPR unit, the 1st Army Corps Sparta Battalion, but they failed so far at taking back Opitny. If you go back up to the Bakhmut area, we'll see that the Ukrainians have been able to push out the Russians from almost all of the area to the west of the Donbas Canal. This entire area that I'm going over in red right now was previously under Russian control, but I have since moved it to Ukrainian control because the Ukrainians have retaken some of these bush lines. They've taken back the road adjacent to the canal. And there's really only one piece of land that's to the west of the canal that's still under Russian control, and it's this one over here. And it makes sense why Russia's still holding on to it, because it's sort of like a buffer zone in between the Ukrainian lines and some of the key Russian towns on the front line. They're sort of forward operating bases, and there are also logistical hubs, towns such as Ozaryanivka, Kordyumivka, and Zelenopilia. And so you could expect these towns to be hit more significantly, especially as the Ukrainians are probably closing in on the last piece of land to the west of the canal. This also makes it harder for the Russians to make future advances, because I know that they do want to, in the future, cross that canal and continue attacking deeper into Donbass. It's going to be harder if Ukraine pushes on the flanks, which is something that they've also been doing to the north of Bakhmut, where in recent days, I think it started on June 6th, the Ukrainians began pushing along the Berkivsk Reservoir, which is pretty close to the town of Berkivka, and they retook some positions that were under Russian control. They actually managed to advance as far to the east as the town of Berkivka itself and took over some of the houses there, but the Russians subsequently pushed them back all the way to the line over here that I'm about to draw. And then on June 8th, the Ukrainians were able to take back some of their positions adjacent to the Berkivska Reservoir. So this is the current front line. You can see that, again, the Ukrainians are trying to push on the flanks and sort of delay any sort of future Russian advances in this area. And so a lot of the fighting is going to continue to occur on these flanks instead of occurring on Chasiv Yar, which is what the Ukrainians would prefer. Now, that's really it for the situation in Ukraine for today. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.